that I want to address today that are asked by people, and it's something that we need to know how to answer. It's something familiar to us, the topic of my message this morning. I'm going to be speaking on the Melchizedec and Levitical priesthood. We know quite a lot about that, but most of the people in the world don't know very much about that. The new ones that are coming into the church don't know very much about the Melchizedec and Levitical priesthood. And we need to be up on those things so that we can help them when they delve into the scriptures. First of all, there are those who say that we do not have to keep the Ten Commandments. They use a verse, one of the verses they use is in Galatians 3:13. If we just take a moment and read that. In Galatians chapter 3, verse 13. Christ hath redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is every one that hangeth on a tree. Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law, is what they say. And they're referring to the Ten Commandment law. But they err in their thinking because they don't read any further than this. They think, I want to do away with the Sabbath, so we can go ahead and use a verse like this and say, well, Christ did away with that, the curse of the law, and we don't have to worry about the law anymore. What about the other 9 also, though? There are other 9 commandments that they're not even considering. What about, then, the verses? First in John chapter 14. And we want to come back to this chapter in Galatians in a few moments. But in John chapter 14, beginning with verse 15, we read, If ye love me, keep my commandments. And I will pray the Father, and he shall give you another comforter, that he may abide with you ever. Those words are rather familiar, but do they follow the first premise? If ye love me, keep my commandments. Then I will pray the Father, that he will give you another comforter. Verse 21, He that hath my commandments and keepeth them, he it is that loveth me, and he that, excuse me, and he that loveth me shall be loved of my Father, and I will love him, and shall manifest myself to him. John 15, verse 10. If ye keep my commandments, ye shall abide in my love, even as I have kept my Father's commandment, and abide in his love. Well, they say, well, those are just Jesus' words, keeping the commandments. But Jesus' will and the Father's will are one on the commandments. And for further thought, in 1 John chapter 5, verses 2 and 3. 1 John 5, 2 and 3. By this we know that we love the children of God, when we love God and keep his commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not grievous. Then what are these verses all about in Galatians 3? What has Christ done away with? Well, we want to keep that question in mind just for a moment. And there's another group of people. And on our trip to Minnesota, I was asked a question on this subject, and it's about keeping the feast days. There's those that say we have to keep the 10 Commandments, and then we have to keep the other commandments, the other laws that God gave, which include the feast days and many other things. You know, God is consistent. He started with the 10 Commandments from the very beginning of the world. We know that sin came about in Adam. He broke a law. Sin came about when Cain killed Abel. He broke a law. If we look to Romans chapter 5, Romans, the 5th chapter, beginning with verse 12. Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for they all have sinned. For until the law, sin was in the world. But sin is not imputed when there is no law. There had to be a law, otherwise there wouldn't be any sin. So from the very beginning, we can see that the laws of God were there, because there was sin from the very beginning. And the sin got so bad that God even destroyed the earth at the time of Noah. So we know his commandments were there at that time. And then we read in verse 14, Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over them that had not sinned after the similitude of Adam's transgression, who is the figure of him that is to come. Even though they didn't sin exactly the same way Adam did, they still did sin, and they still broke God's commandments. And those commandments were enforced. From the very beginning, God set up the fourth commandment, didn't he? He rested the seventh day. And he set aside that seventh day, and he said, I want you to keep that seventh day. We know that he set up the law of the clean and the unclean in the beginning. Noah was told, when those animals were brought onto the ark, that he had to take the clean animals by 7 and the unclean animals by 2. Why is there so much confusion, then, on this subject about God's law? Why do they want to take away God's law? The Galatians themselves were confused because they were keeping this added law of Moses, which we'll get into in a moment. And Paul had to straighten them out. He told the Galatians that they were foolish people. Let's turn now back to Galatians chapter 3. Beginning with the first verse. O foolish Galatians, who hath bewitched you, that ye should not obey the truth, before whose eyes Jesus Christ hath been evidently set forth, crucified among you? This only would I learn of you, receive ye the Spirit by the works of the law, or by the hearing of faith? Are ye so foolish, having begun in the Spirit, and ye now are made perfect by the flesh? Have ye suffered so many things in vain, if it be yet in vain? He's telling them here, why are you returning to these weak and beggarly elements of the law? Why are you going back to the law of Moses? In verse 10, we read, For as many as are of the works of the law are under the curse. For it is written, Cursed is every one that continueth not in all things which are written to the book of the law to do them. If you're going to keep this law, and you don't keep all this law, it said, Cursed is everyone that continueth not in all things. You've got to do all the things of that law. And it was of a curse. In verse 11, But that no man is justified by the law in the sight of God. It is evident, for the just shall live by faith. And the law is not of faith, but that the man doeth them shall live in them. Christ hath redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us. For it is written, Cursed is every one that hangeth on a tree. Here we come back to that same verse again. The law that's referred to here is that added law here. In verse 19, we read, Wherefore then serveth the law? It was added because of transgressions, till the seed should come, to whom the promise was made, and it was ordained by angels in the hand of a mediator. Now, if we go back to verse 10, we see the words at the very end in verse 10. It's called the book of the law. It's identifying which law is being talked about here. It's called the book of the law in various places. And we'll come back to where that's found in a moment. But I want you to remember the words of the book of the law. In verse 23 of the same chapter, we read, "But before faith came, we were kept under the law, shut up under the faith which should afterward be revealed. Wherefore the law was our schoolmaster, to bring us unto Christ, that we might be justified by faith. But after that faith is come, we are no longer under this schoolmaster." So this law that he's talking about was a teaching thing, and it was a law that we read was added because of transgression. But when Jesus came, we didn't need that law anymore. We didn't need that schoolmaster anymore. Jesus did away with that particular law. Now in verse 26 and through 29, "For ye are all the children of God by faith in Christ Jesus, for as many of you as have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus." They were all trying to go back to the old Jewish ways of doing things in this added law. Verse 29, "If ye be Christ's, then are ye Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise." At the time of Abraham, we know that there were no children of Israel at that time, because Israel came from Abraham. There were no Jews at that time. And through faith, we come through Abraham's way of doing things. Now, there are two dispensations in the Scriptures that we need to delineate. In the very beginning, the people of God were under the Melchizedec priesthood. And let's turn in Genesis 14, because we were just speaking of Abraham, and we can read something about Abraham here under the Melchizedec priesthood. In Genesis 14, verses 17 to 20, we know that Abraham just came from battle. "And the king of Sodom went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of Chedorlaomer, and of the kings that were with him, the valley of Sheba, which is in the king's dale. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him, and said, Blessed be Abraham of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thine hand. And he gave him tithes of all." So we can see at this time Melchizedek was the high priest of God, and this was the Melchizedek priesthood, the first portion. This priesthood stayed in force until the Levitical priesthood came on the scene. And that didn't come onto the scene until after the time of Sinai, Mount Sinai, and Moses. In Exodus chapter 20, we read that every day when we come to church. We recite the Ten Commandments. It says, "And God spake all these words, saying," and then we repeat the Ten Commandments. But God spoke these Ten Commandments to his children, and his children were still under the Melchizedek priesthood at that time. The Levitical priesthood had not been put in force at this very particular moment. In Exodus chapter 25, beginning with verse 10, God gave some commandments here to Moses. "And they shall make an ark of shittim wood, 2 cubits and a half shall be the length thereof, and 1 cubit and a half the breadth thereof, and 1 cubit and a half the height thereof. And thou shalt overlay it with pure gold, within and without thou shalt overlay it, and shall make upon it a crown of gold around about. And thou shalt cast 4 rings of gold for it, and put them in the 4 corners thereof, and 2 rings shall be the one side of it, and 2 rings in the other side. And thou shalt make staves of shittim wood, and overlay them with gold. And thou shalt put the staves into the rings by the sides of the ark may be borne with them." In verse 16, we read, "And thou shalt put into the ark the testimony which I shall give thee." God's going to give them a testimony to be placed in the ark. And we know that that testimony is the 10 Commandments. Well, we can see the ark was very elaborate. God told them exactly what they had to do. And in Exodus 31, verse 18, we see the place where the Lord gave Moses the Ten Commandments. And he gave unto Moses, when he had made an end of communing with him upon Mount Sinai, 2 tables of testimony. Remember the tables of testimony, or the testimony that was to be put into the ark? Here are the 2 tables of testimony, tables of stone, written with the finger of God. And these were to be put into that ark. Now we know that while this was going on, the children of Israel were down in the bottom making a golden calf and breaking every single one of the 10 commandments that Moses was receiving at that particular time. And the Lord told him, get down and look at what your people are doing. It made Moses a little angry when you see all those people breaking those 10 commandments like that. And he got frustrated. What did he do? He took these 2 tables of stone. Number one, God had hewed these tables out himself, had written with his finger on these. They're very precious pieces of stone, exactly the words of the 10 Commandments on them. And Moses threw them down and broke them. He was so angry. Say, well, why would Moses break something that precious? He was so upset and so angry at seeing them broken, saying, see, you're breaking these, and I'm not sure what his reason was, but he did break those tables. God was angry with the people, and he was ready to destroy them all at that time, because they were continually sinning and continually going back on his own word. In Exodus 32, verse 26, then Moses stood in the gate of the camp and said, who is on the Lord's side? Who among all you people are on the Lord's side? Let him come up unto me. And all the sons of Levi gathered themselves together unto him. So the sons of Levi came forth when he asked the question, who is on the Lord's side? Now, we know that the Levitical priesthood was established from the Levites. And if you turn to Exodus 40, verse 13, we read here, and thou shalt put upon Aaron the holy garment, and anoint him, and sanctify him, and he may minister unto me in the priest's office. It says, you can go ahead and do this. It wasn't done at that particular time, but this is when he was told to do it. And this was after all of the 10 Commandments, tables were broken, and he had to go back up and receive more tables, or more commandments. Moses had to, of course, hew the tables out himself the next time. But we can see that the Levitical priesthood hadn't quite started until all of this had transpired. And the children of Israel had done so much sinning at that point. In verse 14, thou shalt bring his sons and clothe them with coats. And thou shalt anoint them as thou didst anoint their father, that they may minister unto me in the priest's office, for their anointing shall surely be an everlasting priesthood throughout their generations. So the Levitical priesthood this is the beginning point of the Levitical priesthood here. Now, who was Aaron? How was he related to Moses? If you turn back to Exodus chapter 4. Exodus 4, verse 14. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, is not Aaron the Levite thy brother? I know that he can speak well. So we know that Moses and Aaron were brothers. That means that Moses was a Levite as well. Aaron was a Levite. And of course his children were Levites. And that's where we see that's why it's called the Levitical priesthood. This book of the law was an added law at this time. And God said to Moses, you write this book. I want you to write this book, and you'll place it in the side of the ark. So one of the brethren that I was talking to at the time says, well, where do you find that the book of the law was placed in the side of the ark, where the testimony of God, the Ten Commandments, was placed in the ark? And that's found in Deuteronomy chapter 31. Beginning with verse 24. And it came to pass when Moses had made an end of writing the words of this law in a book until they were finished. You can see that Moses did the writing here. God didn't put these down with his finger. That Moses commanded the Levites which bear the ark of the covenant of the Lord, saying, take this book of the law and put it in the side of the ark, the covenant of the Lord your God, that it may be there for a witness against thee. And this book was to remind them of the sins that they had done continually. And it was to make them so busy keeping all these laws of commandments contained in ordinances, as it's called in other places, that they wouldn't have time to do the sinning. And it was a testimony against them. It was set in the side of the ark at that time. Now this was the very law that Jesus did away with. When we go back to Galatians 3:13 and reading that, that was the law that Paul was saying to these Galatian brethren, why are you still going after these weak and beggarly elements of the law? Why do you still continue to want to keep these things? When Jesus died, he did away with those laws. After Jesus was crucified, the Melchizedec priesthood was reestablished once again. And Jesus was made a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. Let's read that in Hebrews chapter 5. In Hebrews the 5th chapter, beginning with the 5th verse, so also Christ glorified not himself to be made an high priest, but he that said unto him, thou art my son, today have I begotten thee. As he saith also in another place, thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. When the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplication with strong crying and tears unto them, that was able to save them from death, and was heard in that he appeared. In verse 9, being made perfect, he became the author of eternal salvation unto all them that obey him, called of God and high priest after the order of Melchizedek. So we can see now that Jesus is our high priest, and we are under the Melchizedek priesthood. In Hebrews chapter 7, beginning with verse 11, we read, if therefore perfection were by the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, and that's what we were just talking about, what further need was there that another priest should rise after the order of Melchizedek, and not be called after the order of Aaron? For the priesthood being changed, there is made of necessity a change also of the law. And that added law then had to be changed. For he of whom these things are spoken pertaineth to another tribe, of which no man gave attendance to the altar. And we can see then that Jesus had to have a change come about, had to take away these added laws that were in there, and completely do away with those. The laws that God created, that we're following today, were created from the very beginning of the world. As we have seen, the Ten Commandments laws were there, the laws of the clean and the unclean were there, the laws of tithing were there. Even Melchizedek gave Abraham the bread and wine, a symbol of the Lord's Supper to come. These things were enforced throughout the Levitical priesthood. They weren't dropped. These things were enforced today, from the very beginning of the world on through today. The only thing that is not in force now is that added law. It was added under the Levitical priesthood, and it was done away with at the end of the Levitical priesthood. And there should be no going back to the Levitical priesthood. Now, if we go back and want to attempt to start keeping these feasts, like the Feast of Tabernacles or whatever, I was talking to one lady, she said, I used to go and keep these feasts in a certain church, and you had to save a tithe. You had to save another tithe on top of the tithe that you give. And this tithe had to be spent at this particular feast that you go to. If you didn't spend it all, you had to give it away, because you couldn't come back with any of it. So they would really have these big parties and a lot of stuff going on at these feasts that they would go to. And she said, I was treated to some of the finest restaurants and some of the finest dinners, and it was nothing to see a man give a $20 tip to the waitress. And this kind of stuff going on just because they're trying to keep these old feasts and these added laws and just completely making a mockery of the whole situation. But they really lived it up during those times. I guess the more money you made, the bigger your tent was, and the more you had to spend, and so on in these feasts. But we read in Galatians chapter 5, Galatians chapter 5, verses 3 and 4. For I testify again to every man that is circumcised, that he is a debtor to do the whole law. If you're going to do part of this, and circumcision was one of these things they said you had to do under that law, if you're going to do part of this, then you're going to have to do the entire thing. Christ has become of no effect unto you, whosoever of you are justified by the law, ye are fallen from grace. And if you're trying to be justified by this law, this added law that Paul's been talking about all through here, then you are fallen from grace. If you're trying to teach these things, if you're trying to follow these feasts, if you keep one of the feasts, you're going to have to keep every single one of them, and it's not possible to keep every single one of them. You are fallen from grace. So it's something that we need to think about and be able to answer what the priesthoods are when they began and what was enforced during them. Because anything that was enforced in the previous Melchizedec priesthood, except of course sacrificing animals, Jesus took that over, he sacrificed himself for us, is pertainable to us today. So we need to remember those things. And God bless you as you think on these.